Hi everyone, this is Kieron from Proteus Astrology, and I hope everyone is well and coping with 2021. It's certainly been challenging. But every time Sagittarius season comes around, I think of Bruce Lee, among many other great Sagittarians. But Lee, for me, is the quintessential Sagittarian, and that has a special significance because I'm also Sagittarian, but happy solar return to all the other Sagittarians out there. So I'm going to go through his life and death, and let's see where that takes us with the astrological analysis. I don't think there's any particular resonance with the eclipse in Sagittarius that's coming up. It's quite close to his the degree of his sun, but let's begin. So I imagine Bruce Lee just jumping into the room, landing on his feet, arching like an alley cat, raising his arms, but never staying still. He dances rather than boxes. If he picks a fight with you, that's a challenge, but it's also your life lesson. And it'll be over so fast you'll never know how you lost. He was a street fighter, and he took on the giants and usually won. His Chinese name is Li Junfan, but it's otherwise known as Bruce Lee. And he worked incredibly hard to achieve his iconic status as a martial arts teacher and film actor. He was only 5'8", but had a lean and shredded body, weighing only 140 pounds. Yet his massive influence was concentrated into a mere 32 years. So his birth was literally like Enter the Dragon, the famous film, as he was born in the hour of the dragon. This is Chinese astrology, by the way, and in the year of the metal dragon. And dragons were his signature, as the Asian form of the dragon is speedy, fierce, dynamic, and dazzling. And these dragons are supremely fortunate, unlike Western European dragons. The other related synchronicity here was that his mother was superstitious and had originally wanted to call him Siphon, which means little phoenix. And the phoenix is the ultimate symbol of the fully transmuted and alchemized Scorpio energy. And he had a stellium in Scorpio, so that is very fitting. The thing to remember about Bruce Lee is that he was not just an actor, but a director, a choreographer, writer, teacher, and dancer. And that resonated with people all over the world. And Lee's determination to succeed was unstoppable. Yet the interesting thing is that he identified with the fluid and latent power of water, as in this famous quote in an interview in 1971, where he said, "If you try to remember, you will lose. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. If you put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow or creep or drip or crash. Be water, my friend." And that really tells us a lot about him. It sounds easy to say, but this is quite profound, as water is rarely stagnant as an image of power, especially for a fighter. It describes his subtle way of thinking as well, which is never easy to pin down. This perfectly expresses, I think, the fact that he's got all four angles that are mutable. He had Sagittarius Ascendant, Pisces on the IC, Gemini on the Descendant, and Virgo on the Midheaven. And that makes his chart a little bit like a wheel of fortune, showing someone who was continually challenged by circumstances, being on the move, yet also able to adapt. But this water may have been his spiritual form of water, which is just as well as the angles, catch us in all the main areas of life, the body, the home, relationships, and career. And these would have been continually activated for him. But it may also point to a 12th house sun placement, where the ego is dissolved and in retreat even when it shines in the world. But I think there's a touch of the Mercurial about him too. He had a slim, boyish look and supremely physical dexterity and speed. And I think it's the speed of his kicks that everyone remembers. When he was young, he won first prize in the cha-cha dance competition. Just watch his toes move in the fight scenes. So this expression of water for him was more like liquid mercury or an electricity, that invisible current that starts very modest but has concentrated force and power when it reaches peak momentum. He was also very eclectic. He mixed all his fighting styles. He even promoted having no style at all. So this is where the Taoism comes in. Yet he had he was very proficient in lots of different styles. So there's a chameleon-like energy along with the turbocharged ambition. He had Saturn and Jupiter conjoined in Taurus in the 5th house of Leo. So, and he was incredibly creative and industrious in this area. He created his own form of martial arts called Jeet Kune Do, which was his own school. And this was a Herculean effort for him because he was opposed by the traditional kung fu masters who thought it was degrading to reveal martial arts secrets to ordinary Americans. The fear was that it would make Chinese masters vulnerable. But he succeeded against them. He was also one of the few Asian Americans to become a natural sex symbol, which was very unusual. But there was a lot of shirt ripping in the films revealing his bare chest. So with the sun on close to that ascendant, everyone looks at the native. But the self might be fused with the body as well. That's the first thing they see about him. Because that's the doorway to the rest of him. So he had this slippery quality, but fortunately this was combined with the ability to do the long, hard slog of inner transformation with that stellium of personal planets in Scorpio. If you see here, he had Venus, Mars, the Moon, and Mercury in that most alchemical of signs. Mars, I think, is the dirty street fighter in him that punches your eyes out quick as a flash. And to have Mars so close to Venus brings a bit of grace with that, so it softens those blows and makes them elegant to see. This is the burnished luster of Venus in Scorpio. I think he was one of the first to make everyone fall in love with fight scenes, as the way he designed them was so dexterous. They were choreographed as any ballet and turned warriors into dancers. The stellium is also interesting because it would have made him intensely emotional, private and protective, maybe even sharp-tongued with the Mercury in Scorpio, as sometimes people with this placement can be quite sarcastic. If he didn't like something, he would have said so, but he also did it with a smile and a laugh. I think that's the Sagittarian as well. He had a good sense of humor, and people said that he was very entertaining on the set. But I think the main archetype here is the Sagittarius Sun and Ascendant there. This is the athlete philosopher, and he totally represents this archetype. It's the centaur hybrid who combines both physical and metaphysical capabilities, with Jupiter as the ruler of the chart as well. That would just expand all those qualities. He was never about keeping kung fu to the surface appearance just to show off. He had much bigger ideas, and his head usually stuck in books when he wasn't acting. So he wasn't just a fighter, but a philosopher too, on a grand scale. He, with great ambition, he was creative too, with that Jupiter in the 5th in Taurus. But it also made him a loyal friend and father too. Plus he was said to be the life and soul at parties. The projection of himself as a world megastar was, something people commented on, and he definitely achieved that upon death. Sagittarians are also about honesty at any cost, and Bruce Lee said repeatedly that his entire art was about expressing himself honestly. That was his style. That's what he meant by the authenticity of what he did, and that quality of it not being pinned down. And if any director gave him misdirection, he resisted that, and anyone who held him back. But he was usually right as well. So he had this deep commitment to the philosophy of martial arts with its roots in Buddhism and Taoism. And he demonstrates that, I think, by being centered in his own flow, on his toes, literally dodging and noticing the weaknesses of his opponent, plus all the hard training. And that set the tone for all actors to follow. I think it's because of Bruce Lee that most action actors now have to train hard like he did. But there were a few who could outdo him. But if only if his opponents had known that, every warrior has an Achilles heel, and his was that he was short-sighted. But he managed to hide that quite well. But some opponents could have won against him if they had known that, but probably through trickery rather than skill. He certainly wasn't modest of his abilities, yet he lived up to all expectations. Especially when he became the lead star. So there was a long process before that happened, but his big break was in a film called The Big Boss in 1971, which was the first great success. Here he's shown in a TV series that he did before The Big Boss. So we saw that Neptune is conjunct midheaven, and Neptune is associated with the glamour of films and the allure they have over the minds of the viewers. Let's call that pulling power. And his name nowadays pulls audiences in, definitely. The name sells the film. But he was on the film set acting by the age of 6, as his father was also an actor. And this is very Neptunian, was also an opium addict. And with Neptune in the 10th and the sun right there on the Ascendant, it's safe to say that he would be a world-class film star. He could have even become a more regular TV star, but that didn't get off the ground. Here he is seen as Kato in The Green Hornet, which was he was meant to be a kickboxing chauffeur. But he suffered a lot in this role because he had to play second fiddle to the American star Van Williams. But in Hong Kong, he didn't realize that they called it the Kato show there, where he was the star, because they were all looking at him and not looking at the American star. I think another added layer to this Neptune, though, in Virgo, is that it's conjunct the asteroid Chariklo, who was the wife of Kieron. And that is the clear light in the ground of being, the heart of compassion, and certainly an industrious placement for working on the meticulous details of filming. But I think Chariklo would bring that extra layer of compassion and authenticity to his role as a teacher, and bringing that wisdom to the role as well. So what I wanted to emphasize was why I called him the Master of Masters, and I think it's that Sun Ascendant in Sagittarius. That's a double Sagittarian. It's the ultimate martial arts teacher, role model, and mentor. And a lot of his students said this about him. They adored being with him because he had this incredible physical poise, grace, speed, and could do those deadly power kicks. But he was very good at learning quickly, so he was a student as much as a teacher. And I think that's quite Jupiterian. They are students of life. And he was good at playing the role of the teacher as well. He even sounded like a teacher when he spoke, so he would say things like, all types of knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge. But the other Jupiterian thing is that he actually majored in philosophy in Seattle. He studied it, studied the history of philosophy, and he brought his own form of philosophy to the art of fighting. His own teacher, Yip Man, recognized his talent quickly, that he was able to exceed that of the teacher. So and as students would find that he was studying them just as much as he was teaching them. His wife, Linda Lee Cadwell, encouraged him to become a coach in Hollywood, and he soon became the most sought-after fight coach there. And some of his clients, for example, James Coburn, Roman Polanski, and Steve McQueen, all wanted to have Bruce Lee as their teacher. From Steve McQueen, he learned the effortless cool, though, so I think he modeled himself on Steve McQueen. But he was very demanding of his students, just as much as he was demanding of himself. But every minute spent with him was beneficial, according to them. And there is also a quote that he made, which is pure Jupiter speaking in full guru mode. And it goes like this, that ever since I was a child, I had this instinctive urge for expansion and growth. To me, the function and duty of a quality human being is the sincere and honest development of one's potential. And to me, that is pure Jupiterian expansion and potential. Jupiter is the ruler of his chart, as we said, but it also may have explained his creative drive and something else about him that was very interesting, that he was Asian American. He wasn't one thing or the other, he was both. And he was one of the first to become fully global phenomenon, which is also very Jupiterian. He managed to bridge the culture gap, that's Sagittarian, though he was born in San Francisco in 1940, making him a war baby. He cut his teeth in Hong Kong, married an American woman, and had 2 Asian American children, Brandon, born February the 1st, 1965, and Shannon Lee, born April 19th, 1969. But the other thing is, his ancestry isn't even that simple. It was complex, including possible English, German, and Dutch blood. There's a whole story to that. And this complicates even his Eurasianness and makes him an even more fascinating cultural figure. A real blend. He was an enigma, neither Chinese enough for the Chinese, nor American enough for Hollywood. So I want to talk a little bit about the Kieron-Pluto placement. People said he was intense on screen. They couldn't take their eyes off him for a moment. To do that for opponents could have been fatal. But the intensity is not just there in the stellium in Scorpio, which definitely spells inner turbulence and unruly emotions, and he certainly had that. It's also highlighted by the T-square that activates the Venus-Mars in Scorpio and the Saturn-Jupiter in Taurus, both very fixed. But at the apex, there is the Pluto-Chiron in Leo, also fixed. So it's Pluto retrograde too, which so that's a very tensed back kind of Pluto. So he was very Plutonic as well. He was said to have a violent temper, but that aligned with incredibly high work standards. But Pluto is incredibly powerful on that pivot point there. Pluto combined with Chiron, though, is doubly charged with significance because it marks a grand trine of fire linked to the South Node in Aries. So it's beyond intense, like a lethal tripwire, I think, that gets triggered each time it's aspected. I think that he had Mars opposite Saturn alone was deadly enough. But this Pluto is very interesting because one of the stories about Pluto is that it's the micro contained in the macro, the tiny in the humongous. And that's a signature Pluto phenomenon expressed in one of his most loved statements. I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. So it's this laser-like concentration that was there in the speed of his kicks. He mastered the display also of the karate-style 1-inch punch, which I think represents this as well, which was lethal enough to knock people over so fast they barely noticed it happen. He also mastered the fingertip push-up. Not easy to achieve. So I think that Pluto would have added this penetrating insight with this incredible force that he brought with it. But no doubt there were power struggles aplenty in his relationships. That he relished dangerous episodes as well in street fights. Apparently they couldn't keep him out of street fights when he was younger. All mentioned by his friends. They just couldn't stop him. He rarely backed down from a challenge. But that could have led to a taste for danger for its own sake, I think. The fights just to prove that he could have the upper hand. And he was well known that when he was on set, he would rally all the stuntmen around him, as he would be the one in control, managing them all. So he was on record as lamenting about his fame, which he called a cage. He never knew who to trust, and it brought increased doubt to his intimate relationships. So this is Pluto, by the way, an image of Pluto. I think it brought intensity and a complicated need for avoiding boredom. Maybe that caused more trouble than it was worth, and it may have been instrumental in the murky circumstances of his death. But even Pluto Kieron could not control death, and it's poignant, I think, that one of his favourite poems was Christina Rossetti's When I Am Dead. And these lines were actually going to be included in his last film that he was recording as he was just before he died. And perhaps that was a premonition of his death. Kieron is at the first degree of Leo, so it's still testing the waters a little bit in that regal sign. But it's also the disenfranchised underdog, and I think this contributed to his star appeal in the character in The Big Boss, especially, where he takes on the crime lords and just brings them down. But even as a child, he had played the orphans and street urchins as a child star. But I think he had to pay the price for all of that because he was very controlled by his father. But while he wasn't known particularly as a healer, he was also a poet, I think, which is somewhat Chironic. And I think he wanted to be the most complete artist that he could be. And also that when he was a kid, he was born in the war. And there was a cholera outbreak in Hong Kong, so he was a bit punier and less nourished than his older brothers, and this was a kind of setback that makes someone massively overcompensate. He did have a spinal injury as well in 1970 that this is the Pluto Kieron, I think. He had phenomenal powers of recuperation and determination at the same time to recover, because his doctor told him he would never practice Kung Fu again. But Lee, being this indomitable driven kind of character, he recovered and proved the doctor wrong. So he overcame the debility by doing hard training exercise, and it was sheer force of willpower that he healed himself. So his death was very Chironic too. It had a flavour of Pluto in Leo with all the drama. And just briefly, the astrolocational map for Hong Kong, we can see that Lee's Mercury, Uranus and Chiron lines more or less crossed there. So I think this is interesting. If you think that Uranus is anything sudden, Mercury is the nervous system, and Chiron is that vulnerable point. And they all cross here when he was filming. So what happened on that day? The shock waves went across the world. This man, who was super powerful and athletically fit beyond what most men can imagine, was killed by an everyday medication, or so they said. People asked, so how could a mere aspirin kill thee, Mr. Bruce Lee, master of masters? Surely there was foul play. No one believed it was possible. It was ironic, too ironic. And the sun opposed Neptune that day, so sad to say, more commonly than not, there's a story behind the story, but it's only murky because people had a hard time facing the truth of it. The layering of lies that created a web made it very difficult to penetrate. So a week before the main film Enter the Dragon was being released, Lee died suddenly this was July the 20th, 1973. He was 32. I would rather not judge what happened, but I can't help be curious that like anyone, as to why his body was found in his co-star's bed and not in his wife's. This was the Taiwanese actress Betty Ting Pay. Linda Lee Cadwell, Mrs. Lee, his wife, was also in Hong Kong at the time, and the two women were aware of each other. But here's the chart of the time of death, roughly taken around about 10 p.m. So it appeared that Lee was with his co-star Betty discussing the script of Game of Death, which was the other film that he was filming at the time, when he felt sick, and Raymond Chow, the producer, was expecting Lee for dinner that later that evening. And Ting Pei maintains that she just did as she was told when Chow returned, called the doctor, but only after a while called the ambulance as a last resort. She was only 26 and did not have any say in the events as they happened at top speed. Ting Pei was an Aquarian born in 1947, a very stylish and independent woman for her time, and Lee trusted her to be his personal stylist on set, but she was just caught in the tumult of circumstance that ran out of control. It was Raymond Chow who took charge of the PR, and he maintained to news journalists that Lee died with his wife. So within a few days, rumors went around that it was a lie, and the China Star ran a malicious headline saying that Betty Ting Pei's perfume chamber killed the dragon. So what outraged Lee's fans was that he had been given that pill allegedly that killed him by her. So she was loathed and received death threats herself, and so fled into hiding. But she still remembers the love bond with Lee very fondly, and the first impression that he made on her. She said he was irresistible and charismatic, as anyone with a Mars, Venus, Moon, and Mercury in Scorpio would be. And Ting Pei incidentally invested money in the tribute statue to Bruce Lee that's in Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong. There was another reputed girlfriend, Nora Miao, the other co-star, rumoured to have an affair with Lee, but she apparently was Lee's brother Robert's girlfriend. Robert Lee was 8 years younger than Bruce, and he was born December 16th, 1948, so another Sagittarian. He adored his older brother and wrote a song even called The Ballad of Bruce Lee, and even made a film about the mystery surrounding the death. He hired a private investigator to assess what actually happened. So it's a speculation, but as you can see, Mars was conjunct Kieron, the Moon was opposite Pluto square to Saturn, Neptune was on the MC, and Mercury combust the Sun, and it was the hottest day on record, apparently. Look at the synastry between Ting Pei and Bruce Lee. Betty's nodal axis falls directly across Bruce's ascendant descendant. There are plenty of squares from his personal planets to hers, and Lee's Mercury and Moon in Scorpio are sextile to Ting Pei's Venus in Capricorn. His Pluto Chiron is opposite her Moon, and she did say that she saw him as a teacher and a guide, as well as a handsome man with a cheeky, funny face. But also significant, I feel, is that I like to look at the asteroids. Asteroid Eros, which is love that is expressed sexually, as opposed to marital love, is conjunct Lee's Sun in Scorpio. So there's a spark there that could remove any remaining doubt as to the nature of the relationship. And his asteroid Psyche, which is the curious mind involved with Eros, is at 10 degrees of Gemini, exactly on Ting Pay's north node at 11 degrees of Gemini. So there's a Psyche and Eros dynamic here that was also a little bit fated. And the composite chart also shows the north node connection strongly, 1 degree apart from Pluto in Leo. It is fascinating and tangential, but it can't be ignored that Linda Lee Cadwell, who played a powerful role in his life as well. She bore his children, was his very good friend, his wife, and continually championed her husband's reputation after his death. So in their synastry, while they had a Venus-Venus opposition, which is not necessarily a bad thing, her Uranus was on his descendant, so I think she was an electrifying presence for him. And there was an instant attraction, which she mentions in her memoir. But I think she was also the balm to his turbulent emotions, because she acted as a guide and counselor, not just on the set. She knew how to talk to him when others didn't have a clue. And there's a beautiful placement of Chariklo again on his Venus and Mars, which would have been very soothing for Bruce. Her own sun is on the 0 degree point of Aries, so that made her powerful in her own right. She probably didn't even need him, but she was very strongly supportive of him. And it's conjunct the asteroid Psyche. So here again we get another Eros and Psyche connection. So I think Lee had this very powerful impact on the people around him, definitely. Psyche, remember, represents that journey of tribulations in the face of love that is very hard won. And Linda certainly faced those challenges, especially with the death when that happened. Their composite chart also contains a Venus-Pluto opposite the Sun and Mercury. If we return to the death drama, though, many pointed the finger at various other people involved. So there was a suggestion that he could have been killed by gangs of New York, as there were possible motives for removing Lee from the scene. And some cynics even said it was just to promote the film Enter the Dragon to make money. Hong Kong mobsters could have wished to retaliate, as Lee had refused to submit to their demands, and he had a knack for making powerful enemies by his confidence and unapologetic swagger. So stories just spread, and even today there is doubt about the final verdict of cerebral edema caused by an aspirin. Some people said it was a heat exhaustion because, according to records, that was one of the hottest days on record in Hong Kong, and he would have been very sensitive to heat. He had actually collapsed a couple of months before. Mathew, his biographer, believes that it was because he had had his sweat glands removed, which is possible, and that was a complication. But according to his co-star Chuck Norris, it was no mere aspirin, but the continued use of antibiotics, because these were the painkillers that he had been secretly using after his injury since 1968 or 1970. A lot of the stories conflict here. The pill that he actually took was called Equagesic, which is a mix of meprobamate and aspirin, but a standard remedy with only minor contraindications. So the first thing the detective noticed in Robert Lee's film about the death was that it was surrounded by lies. That Neptune was on the MC is very telling. The fogginess of deceits, and the way that immediately the lies were spread to protect his reputation and career. It's still a suspicious death. The chart shows Moon in Pisces opposite Pluto, which is off sign in early Libra. The time is not specific, but roughly around 10 o'clock, because half an hour later, when he arrived at hospital, he was actually declared dead. So there's the T-square as well, with Mars conjunct Kieron in its own sign. opposing Uranus. Mercury was combust the sun, which is interesting. But none of these things in themselves indicate death, but certainly you would advise the native to take care on a day like this, as there might be accidents, or possibly you would advise them not to push or overstrain on that day. So Bruce Lee's son, Brandon, also died in a tragic accident, but that was on a film set. He was also an actor and trained in Kung Fu, and he was accidentally shot dead during the filming of a film called The Crow in 1993. The incident is disturbing, as live ammunition should never be anywhere on a film set. So was it planted there for a reason? This is a moot question. I'm not going too much into the details of it here because it's interesting in its own right, and there are parallels in events going on at the moment. But just to say that it's very odd how it happens, and it only feeds the myth that Lee was placed under a curse, that maybe dragons are not so fortunate after all. And it's an extraordinary pattern, isn't it, when the father and the son both die young in unusual circumstances. And some people believe it was mere coincidence, as Linda Lee Cadwell herself said it was mere coincidence. And that, to me, could mean that she's either incredibly stoical because she lost both a husband and a son to the film industry, or that she's in need of an astrologer. So, to capitalize on the fame that came with his death, there was a spate of copycat films. They called them Bruce Exploitation. None of them were ever as good as the ones with Bruce himself. None of them had his electrifying presence, or let alone his speed. I did look at the Muse asteroids as well. The most obvious one would be Terpsichore, Muse of Dance, but I couldn't see any particular alignment other than that it was in the first house of the body. But I did find that Clio, or Clio as it's sometimes pronounced, the Muse of History and of Teachers, is conjunct his moon. And he did make a very memorable teacher with his 2,500 item library of books. So he managed to represent Clio in some way. But finally, I think it's the Neptune in the 10th that might have led him to martyring himself for his career. That he definitely had increased sensitivity about how he was perceived with that placement. If he didn't have any hang-ups about his mother or a chip on his shoulder about his origins, it was about having to prove himself, as also often happened in an American world. He did say that he found that one of the most difficult things to bear. It might also explain the phenomenal drive towards success and the price he paid for it with the Neptune there. But he did take on mighty opponents and had almost superhuman skills to defeat them, but it took his life as well. So on reflection, we haven't had enough Bruce Lee, and each generation that discovers him in films can see for themselves what all the fuss is about. The 11th house emphasis is interesting as well, because that might have meant he had his finger on the pulse of the collective zeitgeist that represents that cultural drive towards personal fitness, which we all know that everyone is doing now, that we're all copying Bruce Lee. So he embodied that very well. Nowadays, every martial arts school in the world has a Bruce Lee poster on the wall. And he's a much loved figure, probably, I think, much more influential and important than people realize. Actors in action films now have to do kung fu kicks as the norm, but Bruce was the one who set the tone for that and established it as a way to be exciting in film. And there hasn't really been another Bruce Lee in the martial arts field since his death, so his legacy is secure. And one of his girlfriends said he was a kinetic genius, and I think most people would agree with that. This is what set him apart. He was doing something that he was born to do, that only he could do, as both an actor and martial artist. He was a way shower as well, and we need figures like him to celebrate the sun's move into Sagittarius. Perhaps now we can see the big picture, looking through Bruce Lee's eyes. So of all that has happened in 2021, I think he reminds us to keep ever on our toes and to see what the crime lords are up to and to anticipate their next move. But if there's one key message that comes from Bruce Lee to people today, it's this: don't quit on your goals, no matter how hard or impossible they seem. Be like Bruce Lee. Be like water. If you got this far, and I hope you found that interesting. There is a written version on my website, which is proteusastrology.co.uk. Always happy to hear from anyone who wants to send me an email, and I hope to make more of these videos, but they do take a lot of time and effort, and I'm rather busy, but I hope to make more very soon. So thank you again, and have a wonderful end of the year. Thanks very much.